Okay. So as we move, so we have expulsions of Jews in many major countries, but for those countries that allow the Jews to continue to live, their life begins to change in the Middle Ages as well. So we have the Fourth Lateran Council. This is one of the councils of the Roman Catholic Church, which, among other things, requires that Jews identify themselves by some form of clothing. So you've got the yellow badge, but there was also, in some cases, a special hat or headdress that Jews had to wear whenever they were out in public. This is also the development of the period of the ghetto, which initially was the name for the enclaves of Jews. So Jews were forced to live in live in special neighborhoods. Many of them were walled off. They were run out of space neighborhoods there. Many of them were walled off. They were not allowed to freely move outside of the ghetto. Within it, of course, they were, but there were restrictions about their movements in and out in definite places. So you may have heard, for example, of the story of the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II. The very fact that they were almost all living in one place and then it had walls around it was a product of this medieval attempt to remove Jews from everyday intercourse with or socialization with Christians. Of course, Europe is thrown into a lot of turmoil during the Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, but nothing improves for the Jews. And in the many of the wars that are fought because of the Reformation, Jews also end up being pogroms against Jews and deaths and things like that continue. So anti-Semitism is deeply rooted in the European tradition. So as we move into the modern period, I wanted to give you three different examples of different approaches to Judaism. It is not monolithic in any period of time. So I wanted to start with Shabbatai Zevi, who was born in 1626. He is one of these figures that we associate with Kabbalah. But he is also, we don't think about Judaism very much as having a lot of messianic expectation, but throughout the history of Judaism, there have been multiple men who have claimed to be messiahs. He marries just his whole life is very interesting. Marries a woman who believes that has a vision that she's destined to marry and support the Messiah. It's a lot of this sort of mystical understanding based on visions, and he gathers a large following and is declared the Messiah. He is not the only one of these. He's not the first. He's not the last. He's just one of the more famous of these messianic figures that arise throughout the history of Judaism. He unfortunately comes to a very bad end. He ends up being arrested by the Muslims and is offered the choice to convert to Islam or to be killed. And so he does end up converting. But again, he's just one of the more famous of multiple figures over the course of time who gathered followings, claimed some of the messianic expectations, and almost always come to an unfortunate end as those movements are squelched. So, one example. The second one I wanted to talk about is a man named Mendelssohn, born about a century later. He is German, and he is really fundamental for modern Judaism and the development of what it means to be Jewish today. He was a scholar, and I remember this is the period, the Renaissance has come and gone. We're in the period of the Enlightenment, and the belief in human reason, and just sort of a very positive period when it comes to, again, this idea of human reason. And he says Jews are, they're living in the past. They're tied to these archaic rules. the Talmud, and that's holding them back, and it's holding us back as human beings, not just as members of society. So he said Jews should fully embrace the world around them, this enlightenment. They should not live in the ghettos, and they were allowed to move out of the ghettos. They should become they should work in government. They should become scholars. They should become teachers. They should become businessmen and become a part of the larger world. And this is really the call of Mendelssohn becomes sort of the central to what 20th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century Judaism becomes. So he's a big figure for the development of modern Judaism. The third I wanted to talk about is a man named Baal Shem Tov, which literally means Lord, name good, Lord of the good name. And he is Polish. So he comes from that Ashkenazi branch of Judaism, and his followers, he sets up a very, very devout form of Judaism that's very much based on less the study of the Torah and more on behavior. So strict following of the rules. Hasidim just literally means holy ones. Very, very strict, can be often very isolationist as they follow the Jewish law. Because of the fact that Ashkenazi Jews form so much of the influx into the colonies in the U.S. in the 19th and 20th centuries, there are large groups of Hasidic Jews in the U.S., and a lot of those, if you've seen images or read stories or seen on the news about the Hasidic Jewish communities that are very strong in places like New York, they are descendants of this man and his group. So this becomes a large minority population within Judaism that's still very strong today. So again, Judaism is not monolithic. So as we move into so those three figures, this idea of the occasional figures that arise, very mystical, very cultish almost, claiming the Messiah that arose and fell over time. But then in terms of as we move into the modern period, you've got Mendelssohn on the one hand saying, leave behind what's unique for your Judaism, make it private and personal, and become and join with society. On the other hand, you have Baal Shem Tov, and this Hasidic movement that says, no, it is our calling to pull back even farther into our own enclaves and remain holy and untouched by the world. So we move then, Judaism in Europe as we move into the next two centuries. So the freedom of religion that develops first in America, and then the second country to declare in their central constitution the freedom of religion is France. So this idea of the freedom of religion in the constitutions, in the actual constitution, as a constitutional right is new. And it gives a new space for Jews in the European world. And so Mendelssohn then, the followers of Mendelssohn form what is known as Reform Judaism. This becomes an actual branch of Judaism known as Reform. They went out into the larger society. So it's called Reform because, all those rules and laws of Judaism need to be reformed. And I would point you back to your textbook where it gives you that very short paragraph of the statement of Reform Judaism. But instead of looking to the Talmud and trying to update the Talmud for the modern period, they say, no, the Talmud, Judaism, it develops and changes in ways that have now ultimately left behind the need for the Talmud altogether. So the idea of this law-focused form of Judaism that we still see among certain Jews is rejected as Judaism becomes it develops into a new thing again. And so, and the birth of these major branches of Judaism. So basically, with the birth of Reformed tradition, you have the development of Orthodox. So Orthodox are those who maintain the traditional practice, based on the Talmud, and the ongoing attempt to make the laws of Judaism something that can be practiced in the world, whereas the Reform says, no, we don't do that anymore. But also, there's some strong political reasons. So we've got the freedom of religion, a constitutional right, the idea of Jews becoming major parts of their larger society, but there's still sort of this suspicion among Christians that Jews are not going to be, their loyalty to the state is questioned. Your Messiah is going to show up, and then you're not going to follow the Constitution. You're not going to bow down to the governments. There was to give you a modern example, a very similar argument was made when John Kennedy ran for president. Protestants said that we can't trust John Kennedy because his primary loyalty as a Catholic is to the Pope. So it's the same argument in just different religious traditions. So the idea of loyalty to the state, but also the understanding of the homeland, the importance of the homeland of Israel, which is now, if you look through Jewish liturgy, there's a lot of conversation about the return and the hope of the return. It is deeply embedded in their liturgy. But for a Reformed Jew, that is not a political hope anymore. They are not, they are citizens of their birth country, and that is it. So if you're born in France, you are a Frenchman. You are not a Jew hoping someday to return to Israel. So this is an important development in Judaism. But again, it sets up this, what's left, Orthodox Judaism, those who continue to hold to the practices of the Talmud and the strict adherence to the law.